The Pacific wind roars across the deck of the USS Lexington. Steel groans beneath the weight of engines and men. Propellers blur, catching the sunlight like knives. The air smells of oil, salt, and fear. Every movement on this floating airfield must be perfect. One slip, and a man is gone. Amid the thunder, sailors rush beneath the wings of folding Hellcats, their arms steady, eyes focused. They pass fuel hoses, bombs, and tools across the trembling deck, as if balancing invisible trays through chaos. Above them, an officer watches in silence, studying their rhythm, their poise, their impossible calm. He once worked in a hotel dining room, a waiter who could carry a dozen glasses through a crowded ballroom without spilling a drop. That same balance, that same grace under motion would soon train over 5,000 men, turning one of the Navy's most dangerous jobs into a symphony of precision. The war demanded speed. He taught them balance. By the early months of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become the most perilous stage on Earth. Japan's Navy had swept across Asia, its aircraft carriers dominating vast stretches of sea. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the American fleet, and the United States Navy faced an urgent truth. It needed carriers, and it needed men to run them. In a matter of months, new Essex-class carriers rolled off American shipyards. Their decks, long and narrow, were the lifeline of the Pacific War. But for every new ship, hundreds of untrained sailors were assigned to flight decks they had never even seen before. The Navy faced a daunting problem: how to teach thousands of young recruits to handle the deadliest and most chaotic workspace in the military, a carrier deck where seconds meant survival. The deck of a carrier in combat was unlike anything on land. Aircraft engines screamed so loud that orders could not be shouted. Pilots trusted Hans D signals alone. One dropped wrench could be sucked into a propeller, destroying an aircraft. One stumble could send a man tumbling into the sea. Every launch and recovery was a storm of danger and timing. Training schools in Norfolk, Great Lakes, and Pensacola struggled to prepare crews fast enough. Instruction was mechanical, rushed, diagrams on chalkboards, brief drills on mock decks, and safety warnings shouted over the din. But none of it could replicate the living chaos of a flight deck in motion. The Navy realized it needed something new, not just discipline, but instinct, a way to train balance, coordination, and teamwork in real, fluid motion. That's when a peculiar name surfaced at Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego. Lieutenant, junior grade, Harold Jamison, a man with no engineering degree, no flying record, and a resume that puzzled many officers. Before the war, Jamison had worked as a waiter in a San Francisco hotel. He had spent a decade balancing trays of glassware through banquets, weaving between guests, adjusting to every sway and stumble of crowded floors. To most, it was a civilian trade. To Jamison, it was physics in motion, human equilibrium under pressure. When he joined the Navy in 1941, Jamison's dexterity caught the attention of flight deck instructors struggling to maintain order during drills. He noticed the problem immediately. Sailors were not failing from lack of strength or courage. They were failing because they fought the ship's motion. The deck tilted, wind shifted, and men stiffened, losing rhythm with the vessel beneath them. Jamison proposed something radical: teach them to move with the ship, not against it. He began experimenting with balance exercises inspired by his old job, walking with weights, balancing metal trays, and carrying equipment across simulated pitching decks. His superiors were skeptical. The Navy was a world of rules, not restaurant tricks. Yet, after a few sessions, something changed. The men who trained under Jamison's method began reacting faster. They learned to anticipate the ship's motion, to flow rather than resist. Within weeks, Jamison was assigned to oversee a new training module for deck coordination. What began as an odd curiosity, a waiter teaching sailors, evolved into a structured system. Each class practiced with loaded trays filled with sandbags and water cups, running obstacle courses while alarms blared and fans simulated carrier winds. The laughter that once followed Jamison's drills slowly faded, replaced by focus and respect. By mid-1943, the results spoke for themselves. The carriers that received Jamison's trainees reported fewer accidents, quicker turnaround times, and smoother launch sequences. Deck officers noticed an unusual fluidity, men moving in synchrony, steady even under attack. It wasn't luck. It was balance, the kind taught by a man who once served dinners, now serving a nation at war. And as the U.S. Navy prepared for the largest carrier operations in history, Jamison's training methods spread quietly across the Pacific Fleet. From the USS Enter, prize to the USS Yorktown, his strange idea was becoming standard practice. But the storm of war was only growing fiercer. By 1943, the Pacific had turned into a vast chessboard of steel and sky. Every carrier mattered, every crewman counted. The United States Navy had grown from 6 operational carriers to more than 20, yet many of these new vessels carried green deck crews, men fresh from civilian life, whose hands had known farm tools or factory levers only months before. Now they stood on swaying decks beneath roaring aircraft, where a single mistake could end dozens of lives. Training could no longer rely on instruction manuals. The Navy needed instinct, the kind of control that couldn't be memorized. Harold Jamison's methods, strange as they seemed, filled that gap. He turned routine training into a test of reflex and rhythm. He told his men, "Don't fight the deck, feel it." And that single sentence became a silent creed among flight deck crews across the fleet. At North Island, his training ground became known unofficially as the balance room. Wooden floors were mounted on hydraulic pivots to imitate a pitching carrier. Sailors ran obstacle courses holding long metal trays filled with bolts, washers, or cups of water. The rule was simple: complete the circuit without spilling. The slightest hesitation meant starting over. Over time, those who completed the courses gained something beyond coordination. They gained composure. When they transferred to real carriers, those sailors looked different on deck. They moved with confidence, fluid but deliberate, almost like dancers amid chaos. Commanders began reporting a measurable drop in accidents and mishandling incidents during takeoffs and landings. It was enough to draw the attention of Fleet Air Command. In 1944, Admiral Mark Mitcher approved the expansion of Jamison's methods across the training pipeline. Manuals were rewritten to include deck balance exercises, and instructional films were produced to show recruits how to adjust to the motion of the ship. Some veterans scoffed, calling it tray training, but younger officers embraced it. They saw the results firsthand: faster response times, better coordination under wind and fire, and fewer fatal missteps. The flight deck had always been a paradox, a place where calm precision met pure danger. Aircraft with 2,000 horsepower engines screamed past men standing inches away. Landing gear shattered, arrestor wires snapped, and propeller blasts tore through the air. Yet Jamison's trainees learned to operate within this storm like seasoned performers. Their movements became instinctual, synchronized, and efficient. The science behind it was simple but profound. Balance training improved spatial awareness, muscle memory, and micro-adjustments in posture. It also trained the brain to process chaos, to separate motion from panic. Under bombardment or heavy sea conditions, this mental clarity often made the difference between survival and catastrophe. By the time the Navy prepared for the invasion of Marianas in mid-1944, Jamison's balance doctrine had been adopted by over 5,000 sailors across multiple carrier groups. Some officers began referring to it unofficially as the Jamison method. The man himself, still humble and soft-spoken, refused any promotion tied to it. "It's just common sense," he said in one interview. "If a man can carry a tray through a storm without dropping it, he can carry a bomb under enemy fire." In hindsight, his innovation was more than physical training. It was psychological adaptation. It taught men to trust their footing, to stay composed amid the violent rhythm of the sea. It bridged the civilian and the military, showing how ordinary skills could transform extraordinary circumstances. By late 1944, as new recruits continued pouring into Pacific bases, the balance room concept became standard in naval aviation training centers from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. What began with one waiter's intuition was now a cornerstone of operational readiness. But the true test of Jamison's idea, the moment when balance and chaos collided in war's harshest trial, was still ahead. The carriers were heading toward one of the greatest battles in naval history, where every man's equilibrium would be tested under fire. From a human perspective, Jamison's method was more than a training drill. It was a lifeline. The men who arrived at his balance room were often terrified. Many had never set foot on a ship before the Navy. They came from small towns and factories, their nerves tested by the endless roar of engines and the sharp tang of aviation fuel. The first time they stepped onto a pitching deck, their instincts betrayed them. Knees locked, arms stiff, panic rising with every sway of the ship. Jamison understood fear in motion. He knew that balance wasn't only a matter of physics, it was psychological. His drills forced sailors to face instability head-on, to adapt their rhythm to the unpredictable heartbeat of the sea. He spoke little during training, but his lessons were clear. The ship moves, you move with it. It wasn't shouted, it was absorbed, repeated silently by hundreds of men across the Pacific. Within weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Men who had once stumbled under pressure now flowed like part of the deck itself. They learned to bend their knees with each roll of the ship, to anticipate rather than resist. The results showed in every aspect of carrier life, from rearming aircraft to hauling wounded pilots from smoking cockpits. This new sense of equilibrium changed the tone of the flight deck. Where chaos once reigned, rhythm took over. Sailors began working in unspoken unison. One man signaling, another adjusting, a third stepping in perfect sequence. To observers, it seemed almost choreographed. To those who lived it, it was instinct born of repetition and trust. For many, the training offered something deeper, confidence. They no longer viewed the sea as an enemy beneath their feet, but as a partner in their survival. In a war where death often came from above, that balance, physical and mental, became a silent armor. These human transformations would soon be tested in the unforgiving crucible of combat, where composure could mean the difference between saving a life or losing an entire crew. From a tactical and technological angle, Jamison's balance method reshaped the very rhythm of carrier operations. Flight decks, once scenes of frantic motion, began functioning like coordinated machines. Every second on a carrier counted, from aircraft refueling to arming, launching, and recovery. A delay of even 10 seconds in one corner of the deck could ripple through an entire sortie schedule. Efficiency was survival. Before the balance drills, mishandled equipment and collisions were common. A dropped bomb cart, a missed tie-down, a man frozen under prop wash, all small moments that could destroy multi-million-dollar aircraft, or worse, ignite fires that swept across the deck. Jamison's training introduced fluidity into every phase of deck operation. Crews learned to anticipate wind gusts, to angle their bodies with the ship's roll, to distribute weight instinctively while moving heavy ordnance or refueling lines. This transformation didn't just reduce accidents, it increased operational tempo. Reports from Task Force 58 in 1944 showed faster aircraft turnaround times on carriers whose crews trained under Jamison's system. During major engagements, these few extra minutes often determined whether a second strike could be launched before enemy bombers arrived. Precision had become strategy. Even the pilots noticed. Landing signals became cleaner, deck handlers smoother, taxi crews more responsive. Commanders began describing their deck teams as living systems, moving in sync with each wave and burst of wind. What had once seemed an uncontrollable hazard, the motion of the sea, became a tactical ally. In time, Jamison's concept evolved into a formalized discipline. Engineers studying flight deck ergonomics realized that his approach aligned with modern theories of dynamic balance and human factors. Decades ahead of its time, they began integrating similar drills into pilot and ground crew programs, not just to prevent mistakes, but to enhance situational awareness. The waiter's technique, as sailors half-jokingly called it, had proven something profound. Control in war wasn't about rigidity, but adaptation. Balance was not stillness, it was constant adjustment, a living equilibrium between man, machine, and motion. And soon that living equilibrium would be tested in the inferno of real combat, where every second and every step decided life or death. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The U.S. Navy's carrier force stretched across the horizon. 15 flat tops, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men. Above them, the sky was a furnace of sunlight and noise. Below deck, engines throbbed with mechanical heartbeat. It was the beginning of one of the largest naval air battles in history, later known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On the USS Lexington, the deck crew prepared for launch. The air smelled of fuel, hot steel, and salt. Bombs clanked against the deck as sailors rolled them toward waiting aircraft. Each movement was timed, each gesture rehearsed. Beneath the chaos there was rhythm, the invisible rhythm that Jamison had taught them. The order came over the loudspeaker. Launch sequence, go, go, go. Wind tore across the deck. Men leaned into it, balancing against the gusts as Hellcats and Avengers were pushed into position. Launch officers waved their paddles, signaling pilots to power up. The roar was deafening. In seconds, the deck turned into a whirlwind of motion. Propellers spinning, arrestor wires snapping taut, men ducking under wings, securing tie-downs, clearing paths. Then a sudden jolt. A wave struck the hull, tilting the deck at a sharp angle. A bomb trolley slid dangerously toward the edge, a 500-pound weapon rolling free. But before it could topple, 3 sailors lunged, not panicked, but precise. Their bodies adjusted instinctively with the ship's roll, catching the cart and stabilizing it. To the untrained eye, it was reflex. To those men, it was Jamison's lesson in motion. Balance without thought. Minutes later, the first fighter roared into the sky, followed by another and another. The launch cycle, one of the most dangerous operations in naval warfare, completed flawlessly under fire. As Japanese aircraft closed in, the American carriers unleashed wave after wave of fighters. The efficiency of those deck crews meant more planes in the air, more defense, more survival. Across the task force, similar moments unfolded. On the Enterprise, a fuel hose ruptured during launch, an accident that could have triggered a deadly fire. Yet, the crew responded in seconds, moving as one. They sealed the line, rerouted pressure, and resumed operations without losing a single aircraft. Commanders later credited their coordination to balanced training under motion. Throughout that long, blistering day, American carriers launched more than 400 aircraft with record precision. Pilots described landings that felt eerily smooth, even as enemy bombers dove from above. Deck crews worked in cycles of seconds, refuel, rearm, reset, without chaos, without panic. They had learned to trust their footing, their rhythm, and one another. By sunset, the sky was littered with burning fragments of Japanese aircraft. The battle had turned decisively in America's favor. Over 300 enemy planes had been destroyed, while the U.S. lost only a fraction. Historians would later attribute much of that success to superior training and discipline, but those who had stood on the decks knew it went deeper. It was about control amid disorder, calm within noise. In the quiet after the battle, as sailors scrubbed the deck and tended to the wounded, a few joked among themselves. "Guess all that tray balancing paid off," one said, wiping sweat from his brow. Another smiled and replied, "Hell, I'll never spill a drink again." But behind the laughter was truth. The method that had once seemed absurd, born from a dining room, had proven itself under fire. The physics of balance had saved lives. And while the victory at the Philippine Sea cemented America's dominance in the Pacific, the war was far from over. Ahead lay new dangers: kamikaze attacks, typhoon seas, and the relentless grind of late-war exhaustion. The next test would push Jamison's teachings and his men to their absolute limits. By late 1944, the Pacific was changing. The Japanese Navy, battered but desperate, unleashed a new weapon. Human pilots turned into missiles, the kamikaze. For carrier crews, this was no longer just war. It was survival against flying fire. On October 25th, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill faced the full fury of these suicide attacks. Alarms blared across the decks as spotters shouted, "Bogies incoming!" The sky was filled with streaks of metal and flame. Fighters scrambled, but some of the incoming aircraft slipped through. On the Bunker Hill, a Zero dived straight toward the deck, its wings clipped by anti-aircraft fire. It crashed between parked planes, igniting fuel lines. In an instant, the deck became a storm of burning debris. Fire spread like lightning, ammunition cooked off in the heat, and explosions tore through the flight line. Amid the chaos, men who had once practiced balance drills under quiet conditions now faced their final test. Flames licked the deck, smoke blinded the horizon, and the carrier pitched violently as damage crews fought to contain the inferno. Yet, instead of panic, there was precision. Teams moved in rhythm, passing hoses, rolling bombs into the sea, dragging wounded men away from danger. They adjusted to every tilt and shock as if dancing on a living battlefield. Chief Petty Officer Harold Dunn, one of Jamison's earliest trainees, later recalled, "Everything was shaking, explosions everywhere, but nobody froze. We just moved, like the deck told us what to do." His words, recorded years later, captured what balance truly meant: harmony in motion, even as the world burned. The Bunker Hill survived that day, but barely. Nearly 400 men were killed or injured. Yet, against all odds, the carrier remained afloat. Damage control officers credited the survival of the ship to the crew's speed and composure under impossible conditions. They had fought the fire, the wind, and gravity itself, and won. At the same time, across the Pacific on other carriers like the Lexington and Enterprise, the lessons of balance continued to save lives. During kamikaze strikes, deck crews worked amid flaming wreckage, often barefoot to maintain grip. They learned to move fluidly even as shock waves knocked others off their feet. The Navy began formally documenting these performances. Reports noted that crews trained under balance conditioning programs exhibited superior reaction times and lower casualty rates during emergency responses. What had begun as an eccentric experiment by a former waiter was now written into naval procedure. Jamison, still stationed at North Island, received the reports with quiet pride. He never sought medals or command. Instead, he kept training new batches of recruits, always starting with the same words: "Feel the ship beneath you." He knew his method wasn't just about surviving waves. It was about surviving chaos. As 1945 dawned, the war neared its brutal climax. The carriers pushed closer to Japan, enduring longer missions and heavier resistance. Kamikaze strikes intensified, testing every sailor's endurance. And still, the deck crews moved with that same rhythm, steady hands under violent skies. On May 11, 1945, when another kamikaze tore into the bunker hill once again, the crew responded faster than any before. Fires were extinguished, ammunition secured, and pilots evacuated, all in record time. Historians would later note that had the crew not been so disciplined in balance and motion, the ship might have been lost. In those final months of the Pacific War, thousands of men owed their lives to lessons that began far from the sea, in a quiet hotel dining room, under the practiced hand of a man who once balanced glasses through laughter and jazz. Now that same instinct for poise amid chaos had become the difference between life and death. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the carrier decks fell silent. The ocean that had once thundered with aircraft now reflected the calm of victory, and the cost that came with it. Thousands of sailors returned home, many forever changed by what they had endured above the restless Pacific. Among them were the men of the balance drills, Jamison's trainees, whose discipline had turned chaos into coordination. The Navy's post-war evaluations painted a clear picture. Across carrier groups, accident rates had dropped by nearly 40% between 1943 and 1945. Flight deck turnaround times had shortened by minutes, a seemingly small improvement that, in wartime, had meant extra sorties and saved lives. Commanders noted the psychological steadiness of crews trained under motion conditioning, men less prone to panic during emergencies, more responsive under stress. Jamison's work, however, never made headlines. It was classified as part of broader human efficiency studies conducted by naval aviation medicine. To most of the public, the credit went to naval engineering, aircraft design, and command leadership. Few outside the Navy ever heard of the soft-spoken lieutenant who once taught sailors to balance trays as bombs fell around them. Yet inside the fleet, his influence endured. Training manuals kept the deck balance modules long after the war, adapting them for jet operations and modern carrier flight routines. What began as a wartime improvisation evolved into formalized kinetic awareness training, the foundation of what naval instructors would later call motion discipline. For the men who had lived it, the memory stayed vivid. Many wrote home about how those strange drills saved them when the deck was on fire, when the ship rolled, when panic should have won. They knew balance had been more than a skill. It had been survival. In the post-war years, the Navy modernized. New carriers were larger, faster, and built for the jet age. Yet as aircraft grew more powerful, the margin for human error on deck grew even smaller. That's when Jamison's philosophy, movement through motion, found renewed purpose. By the 1950s, Navy training centers at Pensacola and Alameda began including dynamic deck awareness sessions inspired by Jamison's wartime drills. Recruits balanced equipment across gimbaled platforms that mimicked rolling seas. They trained blindfolded to sharpen instinctive coordination, learning to feel the ship beneath them as generations before had done. What had started as a humble wartime innovation became a permanent part of naval aviation culture. Jamison himself retired quietly in 1953, his contribution barely recorded in official archives. He returned to civilian life, working once more in hospitality, this time teaching young servers the art of composure under pressure. Few who learned from him ever knew that their mentor's lessons had once steadied men amid explosions and fire. Decades later, naval historians rediscovered his name in training documents and after-action reports. His story resurfaced as a reminder that warfare is shaped not only by weapons and tactics, but by human ingenuity, by ideas born far from battlefields. In a war driven by machinery, one man's understanding of balance proved that survival could depend on grace, not brute force. Modern carrier operations still reflect that truth. Today's deck crews, guided by computers and catapults, still train to move as one. Every gesture measured, every step sure. The language has changed, the tools evolved, but the core remains timeless. Feel the motion, trust your balance. It is a legacy written not in medals or monuments, but in the steady footsteps of those who learn to master chaos and find rhythm in the heart of war. War is often remembered through explosions, victories, and names carved in stone. Yet beneath those grand moments are smaller, quieter truths. Lessons born not from command rooms, but from human experience. Harold Jamison's story is one of those truths. He never fired a weapon or flew a plane. He never commanded fleets or plotted strategies. But in teaching sailors how to balance through motion, he gave them something far rarer: control within chaos. His lesson transcended war itself. That steadiness, not strength, often determines survival. On a carrier deck where wind and fire rule, balance became more than a physical act. It became a mindset. It reminded men that even in the most violent storms, calm could still exist, that in mastering motion, one could master fear. Long after the Pacific battles faded into history, the rhythm Jamison taught still echoes across steel decks and rolling seas. It lives in every flight. Deck crew that moves in silent harmony, every sailor who steadies their breath as the deck shifts beneath their boots. Balance, a simple word, a fragile art, once saved thousands of lives in a war that threatened to consume them all. And perhaps that is the hidden heart of every great conflict, not just the weapons forged, but the wisdom carried, from a waiter's steady hands to the decks of the most powerful ships ever built. In the end, it wasn't just about balance on the sea, it was about balance within ourselves.